In this series of interviews about understanding factions and building allies, you'll hear from 6 of my colleagues about the systemic pressures that make our jobs hard to do, about moving from cynicism to curiosity, about finding uncommon allies, about the dangers of doing a dance of outrage, and about what leadership looks like when we think and work collectively. What one thing would you say, if you were to kind of just focus on one element of your coaching practice, changed as a result of infusing and ultimately building a practice around adaptive leadership?
I think the biggest difference is to begin to think about people as part of a system, as opposed to people just with flaws. Looking at a systemic view of, and asking the question over and over again, what is the pressure in the system that makes people act the way they do? It's had the most profound change, because it's given me a window into understanding people. It's given people access to their own fear of loss and concern about their status and their well-being and their competence and all that. And so a lot of things that before, I mean, I was the head of executive development at a Fortune 100 company at one point in my career, and I didn't have the framework. I just thought we had Everestic, inconsistent leaders who we were just putting out fires for all the time. It wasn't until years later that I began to think about the pressure that they were under, both internally and externally, and the kind of model that that company was using, that made the jobs really hard to do, and didn't give them much that they could count on or bank on. And so they were, I have a much more compassionate view about how difficult it was to lead in that context than I did when I was the guy in charge of their development.
I got into this studying group interaction and how people could deliberate to make tough choices. So I was really interested in processes that people were using, if possible, democratic processes that people were using to make decisions where there were trade-offs. And I had a background in communication, and I was researching public deliberation and accidentally bumped into some folks who were starting to develop a leadership institute for the common good. And they were using in part some adaptive leadership ideas, and they were influenced heavily by those. And it just felt like a perfect fit. It felt like the move from helping people talk about tough issues and explore the trade-offs, mostly on the level of values, to a process and a method of teaching a process called leadership that put those ideas into practice. So in my world, and I was coming from a university perspective at that time, it was just a great way to move from talking about it and helping people reflect on it to getting people to actually do something. And they call that like an active leadership. So when I bumped into the adaptive leadership ideas, they not only aligned well with some of the things that I already had commitments to, but they sort of made the leap to application, which you might call behavior change or how to change organizations or cultures. So I think that's what was seductive about it. And, here we are a decade later. And I still think that leadership development is a way for people to put ideas about how to share power, about how to deliberate, about how to make tough choices into action.
And how about personally? I mean, how's it grown and developed you? How's it changed you?
I think I'm a little less cynical. And I say that by I think having to remind yourself to stay curious about the values and the losses that a particular faction might be showing up with or might be living with has made me, going back to that, more productive. And by productive, I just mean, I think I'm a more helpful person, and certainly a more curious person by starting a conversation, or as you're working with people, reminding oneself that that's probably what's going on. So in that way, it's been really nice. From the from like a bandwidth perspective, from like kind of getting wider perspective, I think it's been helpful just to have a different kind of language to hold up, to sort of make sense of the world. And that language is more diagnostic and more experimental than maybe the language of that's true or that's not true. So that, I think those two things have been really helpful.
You said that you think it's made you less cynical?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm more optimistic about the future, I think, now than I was.
What was cynicism protecting you from before that after this you don't need quite so much protection from?
When you're cynical, you have a pretty healthy dose of confidence that you're right. You know, to be cynical is to like put your finger on it, and then to, you know, poke at it, make fun of it, or make sure that you're not it. You know, whatever is the. So I think that's the protection, is the letting go of that a little bit, of the certainty, or the fact that whatever ideology or whatever belief system you're using is the it thing. I don't know if that's a very good answer to that, Jill.
Well, when you were talking, I thought about cynicism as protection against being blindsided or being disappointed or being.
That's interesting.
And I also thought then when you responded, I was thinking about cynicism as making sure you were right.
Yeah.
Like buffered against being wrong or exposed or.
Yeah, I think it's, I like the exposed, the wrong, I think cynicism is a veil for it. I think cynicism is another version of certainty. You know, I'm going to put a stake in the ground and here's my take, and I'm going to see the world in ways that are consistent to that. And I'm not a part of whatever I'm degrading or whatever I'm cynical about. You know, I'm sort of removed, like on the balcony, I guess, in the adaptive. I'm up here, you know, poking and critiquing at something that is not part of my mess. It's just part of the reason we're screwed or flawed. And, you know, I think, and this isn't like, I don't think adaptive leadership makes you feel like an overwhelming sense of optimism. That's not it, because what I liked about some of these ideas is the sober sort of holding up and acknowledgement of loss. That doesn't feel like I'm super excited and optimistic about the world. But that process, particularly holding yourself and the people you're around in diagnosis longer than they want to, the experience has been that it does open up more opportunities than, say, showing up with, you know, one pair of glasses that might lead to a cynical read. I think that's the productive part. When I was saying productive, that feels more productive.
So just a few moments ago, Tim talked about the need to put on other people's glasses. Tell me, Sarah, how and when you've been able to try another lens to make sense of a situation you're facing.
I mean, I'm doing it with somebody, a woman on my team who's very different to me. A woman on our team, she's a peer of mine, and we're doing it together. And she's an Excel junkie, and she's into evaluations, and I'm into purpose and change. But together we have a way of, you know, and I say to her, I want you to hold my scenario, which is and play with it, and I'll hold your scenario and play with it. In other words, there's to find the uncommon allies, the ones that can also, you know, that you can learn from. I don't know, there's like, everybody seems to, I don't know if you see this on I don't know, social media or wherever you're on, but like everyone's, you know, everyone's theory that they had originally is now the theory that's going to solve our problem. It doesn't matter whatever they were doing before. It could be anything. It could be stats, could be science, could be our fields. So like we all kind of something about our defaults, our theoretical defaults that we dig our heels in, and we then say, this is it.
At the moment in our gatherings of our like types, in our factions, if you will, We do a familiar dance of outrage together. But when do we ever hold each other accountable in those moments? We add fuel to a fire that's already burning in the wrong place. We need to move that fire elsewhere. You could say, in holding ourselves accountable, we can see that our own barriers are really well established. One of the experiments we could hold is to foray into the other side, to make bridges across. We don't seem to have the resilience or robustness to do that, or even the willingness. So I think there are places that we can go, but we need to just look at some other ways of seeing what's going on in order to free up the whole system of exchange. But most of all, free up ourselves.
And sounds like your sense is that the first place that those conversations happen are within sort of our own people. That we are in no way poised to reach out until we begin to make sense of our own desire for affiliation, for hanging out in the echo chamber, for dancing the well-known dance, and our inability to weather what it would take to disrupt that and to be the uncomfortable voice that might risk finding things a little chillier for you in those, cozy places you go to again and again.
Yes, I think we are engaged in deep resistance. We are resisting reality. And we've got some pretty well-worn ways of doing that, which are satisfying and soothing, take away the pain for a little while, allow us to express ourselves in what appear to be powerful ways. But if we take a more of a balcony perspective, really?
It almost sounds like you think we're quite fragile.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
Maxime alluded to the resistance we've been engaged in as a form of self-soothing. As you listen to Hugh, listen in for what creates that need for self-soothing and for what makes us fragile in the face of work that's adaptive.
Growing up as I did in Northern Ireland as a member of the Catholic community, and particularly, growing up situations as the minority, feeling oppressed, feeling pretty scared actually. And then starting life as a high school teacher when what we referred to as the Troubles erupted, the whole place blew up. I was a member of a project that was set up by one of the universities in Northern Ireland. It was really one of the first efforts to try and address this conflict. They brought together a group of 15, I forget the numbers, but a group of Catholic teachers and a group of Protestant teachers, because in Northern Ireland, schools are very segregated. Mm-hmm. There's only about 3 or 4% of children attend mixed schools. So tribalism sets in very quickly. You end up in your own tribe, so you go to separate schools. And we got involved in this. Again, we didn't have the word technical and adaptive, but it was a very technical project of developing curriculum materials that could be used in both sets of schools about teaching religion in Ireland. Very basic stuff, But none of us really noticed at the time is that here was this group of teachers coming together across this divide, and we couldn't talk to each other. And the thing that struck me afterwards, we didn't even notice, It's like a fish in the water. You don't see you're not aware of the water you're swimming in.
When you said that you had this realization that these two groups couldn't talk to each other, My guess is they were talking to each other, but what was it that makes you say they couldn't communicate? That there was something there was a barrier. What was happening that suggested that was the case?
I think it was at some, it was too unconsciously, it was too frightening to go there. Like, all of us has been touched. I mean, I had two brothers of a friend of mine had been ambushed. One was killed, and the other lost his eyesight, Car bomb exploded and killed the father of 3 Protestant boys in my street. I grew up with them. All of us have been touched, but this is not what we talked about. We got so involved in, what should go into, a project, this technical stuff, informational stuff in these curriculum units. That's where our attention went. And it was all, again, now we'd understand this as sort of avoidance, like this in adaptive leadership, this idea that we avoid adaptive work, the complex challenges that are about values. We avoid it by making it technical. Well, this is a very classic example. Looking back, I can see that's exactly what we did.
So you were talking, but you were talking around all the landmines. You were only talking about the sort of crisp, technical, granular, logistical pieces, not about the kinds of loss and fear and trauma that was, like, it sounds like it was pretty palpable.
But everyone is there with their flag, their tribal flag, looking for their piece of the pie. Because to me, the leadership of the future is this sort of moral leadership of people who are there because they can set the flag at the door. They're there on behalf of the whole human family. When we get to that stage, we have a body, a global forum that is of that quality. It's not just people there, with waving the flag for their piece. That's the future, I think. That's what hopefully we can begin to work towards.
There's so much wisdom out there when you open yourself to it. And this is not a lonely, warrior's journey to find it out by yourself. It's an awakening and an opening to just, there is so much wisdom around us when we are honest about the questions that we are struggling with within ourselves. And we can move pretty far, pretty fast if we are open to that sort of inquiry.
Yeah, that resonates. This notion that letting go and inviting other people in and to hold that with us and deeply tapping into the wisdom of others. As you reflect back on understanding factions and building allies, a few questions might help these practices and ideas land more deeply in you. If you think back to Jeff's comments, for example, you might ask, what are the pressures in the system you work in that make it tough for people to thrive and to collaborate, to be curious and to learn, to experiment? You might also consider Tim's comments and begin to explore what veils of cynicism, of certainty, of optimism do you wear, and what do those veils keep you from seeing? You might also reflect on Sarah's comments and ask yourself, who's an uncommon ally you might talk with and work with? Think as well about Maxime and wonder, who are your partners when you do a familiar dance of outrage? And what fire does that dance fuel? I think too of Hugh's comments and would ask you to sit with this question. When are you able to set your flag at the door on behalf of the larger collective? And finally, thinking back to Max's words, when and how are you a lonely warrior? And what does that serve?